It's the week ending Saturday the 8th of January 2022, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the release of a historic settlement document between Prince Andrew's accuser Virginia Giuffre and the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein, disgraced Silicon Valley entrepreneur Elizabeth Holmes found guilty of fraud, and tennis world number one Novak Djokovic at the centre of a COVID vaccine row at Australia's border. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kate Samuelson and Sorcha Bradley. And we welcome back the journalist and author who's in everybody's top 3 science correspondents from The Economist. It's Alok Jha. Alok, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A new window onto the universe.
Thumbs up from Jean-Luc Voyer. All systems are go. We're inside a minute now. T-minus 50 seconds and counting. As you heard earlier, the Vulcan 2 engine will ignite. Turbo pumps will come up to flight speed for 7 seconds, and the command will be issued to ignite the solid rocket boosters. The James Webb Space Telescope will be on its way.
The NASA broadcast of the European Space Agency launching the James Webb Space Telescope on Christmas Day, Alok, is this what the Jha household were watching instead of Mrs. Brown's Boys?
Yes, basically. This telescope has been something that I, as a reporter, have been waiting for about 15 years. So many times I've written stories that say, well, we'll only find out the answer to this cosmological question once the James Webb Space Telescope launches. It's something that's been on the minds of people for a long time. It's the biggest, most sophisticated, most expensive, and most delayed scientific instrument ever blasted off into space. And the fact it made it into space on Christmas Day is kind of fitting in a way.
And what are the cosmological questions that are being answered by this launch?
Well, there's a lot about the universe that astronomers just don't understand.
And we're going to put it all to bed in the next 5 minutes, just to be clear.
I'll outline some of them. I'll outline some of the questions for you. So, all of the stuff that we are familiar with, atoms and molecules that we're made of, stars and planets are made of. Turns out that that's only 5% of the actual universe. The rest of the universe is two materials which we have no idea what they are: dark matter, dark energy. 95% of the universe is mysterious. We don't know what it is. So, you need to sort of try and investigate what all that stuff is. And the James Webb Space Telescope will allow us to start understanding some of that stuff, because what it will do is it'll see back in time much, much further than any telescope that's been able to do so far. So it'll see back to the very, very, very first stars, very first galaxies, just a few 100 million years after the Big Bang.
But because the light that it's seeing is reaching it sooner than it does to the naked eye on Earth, but still millions of years after it happened. I'm trying to do this in layman's terms.
Telescopes are often called time machines, because what they do is they look at starlight, and starlight takes a certain amount of time to travel to you. So the further you look in space, the further back in time you're actually seeing that. So essentially, look at it this way: when you look at the sun, not that you should look at the sun directly, but if you were to, it would you're looking at the sun as it was 8 minutes ago. What space telescopes and other telescopes can do is, by looking at ancient starlight, they see the universe as it was millions of years ago. Now, the very, 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 very earliest stars and galaxies, because they're expanding away from us, the starlight from them stretches. And so the visible light that we normally would see with our eyes or telescopes, it stretches so much that it becomes invisible and becomes infrared. So what you need is a special type of telescope. And the James Webb Space Telescope is that telescope. We've not been able to do it before.
Yeah, it is a very different type of telescope, isn't it, Sorcha? And it's hard to get a sense of perspective when you see a video from outer space. But it's massive.
Yeah, it's absolutely huge. It weighs 7 tons, and when it's all fully assembled, which is happening in stages, it'll be the size of a tennis court. At the moment, they've just kind of put in place their secondary mirror, and the next stage is to essentially unpack the giant primary mirror, which is a really important component of the telescope. And it's the biggest reflecting surface ever sent into orbit. And it's about 6.5 meters across. And it's made up of 18 hexagonal segments, which are each 4.3 feet. And it's basically this segmented mirror that will pick up the light from the very first stars in the universe, hopefully.
And that's what makes it not a Christmas Day story, but a this week story as well, Kate, because it's unfolding as we speak, basically, isn't it? To get it into the rocket, into space, they had to fold it up like origami.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was pretty nail-biting when the first things started unfolding, and we've still got, as Saoirse said, bits to come. It was just far too big, the mirror, to be launched as a single piece of glass, and that's why it was all segmented, but nothing like that has ever been attempted before.
And that's what makes it a very different design to Hubble, isn't it? Because it's kind of a replacement for the Hubble Space Telescope, right?
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if replacement is necessarily the right word. I think that the scientists like to call it the successor. The James Webb was actually planned more than 30 years ago, which is before the Hubble launched in 1990. And unlike Hubble, the James Webb has been built to image and analyze the cosmos using infrared light. And it's more sensitive by a factor of about 100 than all other telescopes that came before it. And there are some other key differences with the Hubble too. So the Hubble's first years were really embarrassing for NASA because the images were out of focus. Its main mirror hadn't been polished to the right curvature, and this wasn't detected before launch. So a lot of work has gone into making sure that the mirrors of the James Webb telescope don't repeat that mistake. And also, interestingly, when the Hubble launched, there was a big protest against it. Some people were really afraid that it was going to see God, and that kind of anxiety wasn't present this time around.
I mean, whatever it does see is going to come back to us very clearly, Alok, in crystal clear definition as well, isn't it? Which is a big difference. I mean, I mentioned the footage that I saw of just the telescope detaching, and that, I mean, it looks like it was filmed, and I mean this in a complimentary way, it looks like it was filmed on an iPhone, but on the latest phone with 4K video. I don't understand how that got beamed back to Earth so quickly and in such precise definition. I suppose the answer is it's got a satellite strapped to it, has it? I don't know, but it looks amazing.
Well, I mean, the Hubble Space Telescope is based on technology from the 70s and 80s, and James Webb is 90s and early 2000s, which is in technological terms still ancient, but also it's so much better than what Hubble is capable of. And the images you'll get in about 6 months' time, it'll start sending back scientific data and images, and the images you're going to get from James Webb, just of the cosmos, of different planets and stars and galaxies and things and ancient ones, are going to be so much better than even Hubble. And Hubble has done an amazing amount to make us all kind of stare in wonder at the universe itself. So you're going to get all of that, but also the scientific questions that it's going to answer are so much more sophisticated, and that kind of explains also why it's so big and why it looks the way it does. Hubble, it looks like a telescope, it's just a sort of tin can with a mirror at one end and it collects light and that's it. This one, it sort of looks like, as you said, as we said earlier, it looks a bit like it's the size of a tennis court, and it has this sort of weird hexagonal gold mirror. And it's like that because all of the instruments have to be super, super, super cold. Like we're talking minus 230 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, why is that? Because the Hubble's at 20 degrees Celsius. So, I mean, I'd understand they need to protect them to minus something when it's so close to the sun, but why that much?
Well, so actually, James Webb Space Telescope will be 1 million miles from Earth. It'll be really far away from the sun. And even then, any stray infrared radiation, infrared radiation is just heat. So any stray heat from the Earth or from the sun will sort of completely blot out any of the information it wants to gather from the very, very ancient stars, which are something like 13.5 billion light years away. So, it needs to be really, really cold. It needs to sort of push away all that other stuff. The layer of foils that the gold mirror is sitting on essentially is a shield which protects the instruments from the sun and from the Earth. And so that's why it looks like that. And then that's why it's been so hard to make. And that's why it's taken so long to make it. It's incredibly sophisticated, advanced engineering.
And that sounds expensive, Kate.
Yeah, it certainly was extremely expensive. It costs around $10 billion, and it's taken a better part of 3 decades to design and build. And according to NPR, originally the cost of the telescope was estimated to just be around $1 billion to $3.5 billion, with the expected launch dates ranging from 2007 to 2011. So considering that this telescope launched on Christmas Day last year, it was about 10 years off the estimates. The cost has actually been quite controversial. There were lots of delays, which kept adding to the budget, and the team behind the telescope faced these huge pressures to keep the cost down. And then in 2011, lawmakers in the House of Representatives in the US voted to end what many people in the general public kind of saw as being like a magic money tree. But scientists and space enthusiasts, including lots of school children actually, came together and they applied political pressure to save the project, and eventually there was a deal with Congress and the work continued, although, as I said, it was a decade before it ultimately launched.
Sorcha, do you think it's worth the money? I mean, do you come down on the side of those who think this sort of intrepid exploration is the best use of taxpayer money because it's so meaningful for mankind? Or are you one of those people who think space just shouldn't be a political priority? We have hospitals to fund, we have wars to fight.
I think on a bad day, I probably would come down on the side that it's a bit of a waste of taxpayer money when I'm looking at newspapers and deciding that everything's going horribly wrong. But I think also there's a really exciting question that's trying to be answered with the launch of the telescope, which is, where do we come from?
When people ask whether these sorts of instruments are a waste of money, I think there's three levels to the answer, and I'll go through them quickly. One is this money, $10 billion, is a lot, and they spent too much on it. And frankly, it should have been cancelled way earlier. And I'll say that as a fan of space. But it wasn't, and we're going to have some interesting things that come out of it. But that $10 billion was spent not in space, it was spent on Earth, on people, on jobs, on training PhD students, on training scientists, and building infrastructure, designing technology, which we're all going to eventually end up using at some point. I mean, the Apollo missions, I think, they spent something like 3% of US GDP in the 60s, and every dollar they spent has returned $40 to the economy. So these are economically quite useful things. And those scientists don't all become scientists in astronomy. They become doctors and they become data scientists, and they do things like create vaccines in the future. You know, you need people like this in the world, and this is the kind of thing that challenges people to create completely new things. Also, $10 billion is not that much money. It's over 20 years. And we spend a lot more money on lots of other things that are less. And so this idea that we can only spend $10 billion on the James Webb Space Telescope or a hospital, I think it's a false choice. You need to be spending both these things. And bear in mind, test and trace costs £22 billion. So we have the money. We're rich countries. We have the money.
I thought it was interesting as well to see that if you converted the cost of Hubble into today's standards, it would have cost nearly $15 billion, which is obviously more than what James Webb cost. And if you look at all the discoveries that have been made from the Hubble over the last 3 decades, then I don't think anyone's really doubting its value.
Yeah, Hubble discovered dark matter. There you go. And dark energy. Not dark matter, dark energy.
Okay. We will be covering some more dark matter with Kate after this. Kate, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Laughter is the best medicine, apparently.
1 in 4 people suffer from some sort of mental illness. So if it was 1, 2, 3, 4, it's you, sir. You. Yeah, with the weird teeth. And you next to him. You know who you are. Actually, that whole row isn't right. That's not good. Hi, yeah, real bad. Don't even look at me.
Ruby Wax, delivering her TED Talk, What's So Funny About Mental Illness, back in 2012. You can watch the full thing on their YouTube channel. Kate, what's the story?
Patients trying to deal with trauma may be sent on free comedy courses by the NHS. These sessions have been developed in partnership with Angie Belcher, who has the amazing title of Comedian in Residence at Bristol University, and she's also got a master's in psychology. And she said that this 6-week pilot course will help people gain a new perspective on difficult experiences, from trauma to gender dysmorphia, for example. And these sessions will be delivered by professional comics through the Bristol Wellspring Settlement Social Prescribing Team, a bit of a mouthful. And from this month, GPs in Bristol will be able to prescribe this 6-week pilot stand-up comedy course, which is called Comedy on Referral on the NHS.
How Bristolian does this idea sound? Okay. So, I mean, I can see a certain type of person, a sort of Ruby Wax type person, I suppose, who's very out there and likes to wear their personality on their sleeve as a way of processing things, might enjoy this kind of referral. But are we really saying someone who's got PTSD because, I don't know, they've been in a car crash and now when they hear people coming up behind them, it makes them freak out? They're going to be helped by talking about that as a stand-up comedian? Is that the idea?
Well, I wouldn't say that this kind of approach is necessarily going to work for everyone, but evidence does show that using comedy can be a really important and helpful tool in overcoming mental illness. For example, I saw on social media that a man who had been on holiday when a terrorist attack took place in Tunisia in 2016 and had PTSD as a result of it, he said that comedy had really helped him and his cousin deal with the aftermath of the attack.
But that's watching comedy, no?
No, that was taking part in a similar course to the one that's being trialled in Bristol.
So standing up and telling jokes about a very difficult experience in your life, basically.
Yeah, so I think these courses are stand-up courses, but they'll focus on all different things. So my understanding is that they'll use a combination of psychology and storytelling to help people kind of embody their inner comedian, which we all have. And that will in turn equip them with skills to become more resilient and happier. And in terms of the sessions, it's likely that it will feature things like kind of confidence building, trust exercises, word games, things that really encourage the participants to trust each other and also share things that are personal to them.
Sounds like the unfunniest stand-up gig ever, Sorcha, watching a whole load of people that have been in terrorist attacks talking about their experiences. But I suppose this isn't for the audience, is it? This is for the participants. And it's not a new idea that you should use comedy to tackle your demons, I guess.
No, and it taps into, as Kate was saying, this idea of social prescribing, which is also known as as community referral, where people who are experiencing issues that can't be fixed by medicine or traditional therapies alone can turn to local community groups and activities. And it all kind of stems off research by Sir Michael Marmot from the University of London, who have found that a person's health and mental health is actually largely determined by social factors, so their work, their environment and their relationships. So certainly there is evidence to suggest that doing more community-based activities can have a huge effect on people's mental health if other traditional methods haven't proven to be as effective as they might have hoped.
But isn't that just a sexier name for social work or occupational therapy?
Well, social prescribing actually goes a lot further because it's more about immersing people in their communities. So some examples of social prescriptions could be a person that's suffering from loneliness being connected to a community-led gardening project, for example, or someone who's been diagnosed with dementia and is feeling anxious about it being signposted towards a dementia support group in their neighbourhood. So it's all about immersing people in local neighbourhood and community initiatives that are going on, rather than being more like traditional occupational therapy.
Alok, do you think GPs are going to be on side with this? It's all very well having the initiative, but it relies on a doctor to suggest it to someone as a prescription. And that might feel like a slightly uncomfortable or inappropriate thing to do if they've come to you asking for help with depression or motivation or, feelings of self-loathing.
Well, I'm sure a certain percentage of doctors will be and a certain percentage won't. It depends on how effective the evidence is for this. But on a broader societal level, I think that there is definitely a case for demedicalizing conditions and not just jumping to medical interventions that require pills or surgery or whatever else. Anything you can do that allows people to sort of help themselves out of a situation. And mental health is really amenable to this sort of thing. Now, of course, some very severe conditions will require very professional help. But if lots of others can just be aware of how they're feeling and know that the treatment they can get is to do some gardening or go and talk to some friends. And it also speaks to something that I think is kind of has become very clear in the last couple of years as we're all sort of stuck at home. Humans are a social species and we feel better when we speak to other people or spend time with other people. And I think that it makes a lot of sense that if you're feeling low, if you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling unhappy, that changing your scenario, talking to someone, telling jokes, all of these things would help. It's much easier to sort of deal with that, especially if you're concerned that by going to your GP and telling them that you're feeling a bit unwell, that you're suddenly put on antidepressants and you don't want to be seen as a person who's on antidepressants. All of this stuff I think is really positive.
But it does doesn't it sort of put the emphasis on the patient to make themselves better? I mean, so the advantage of drugs is you can sort of say, oh, here's a chemical thing that will make the chemicals that are wrong in a different way better. Whereas, there's a sense of, there could be a sense of people feeling they're being told to pull their socks up when they've gone to a doctor for drugs.
I suppose you could look at it like that, but I think this is essentially another method that the NHS hopes it can use in order for people to, I don't want to say treat themselves, but have more tools in their arsenal for mental health issues, and also kind of other wider societal factors as well. According to kind of research from the Mayor of London's office, 20% of people visit their GP for non-medical reasons, and GPs hope that kind of these social prescribing schemes can reduce non-essential visits to the doctor and also hopefully ensure people get the most appropriate form of support that they can get that will actually improve their mental health and well-being, instead of maybe using traditional methods like CBT, which is offered a lot on the NHS, that doesn't really necessarily work for everyone. And in fact, there is research that shows that CBT for some forms of mental health problems, it isn't really effective at all. And yet that is the primary kind of port of call if you're entering the NHS mental health system at kind of its first initial levels.
And Kate, you've chosen this as your story of the week, presumably not because it's got a 6-week pilot course in Bristol, but because you think this will go on to become a more significant story. Do you think that the trial's going to work? Do you think it's going to be more widely adopted across the country?
It's hard to tell right now. And there was kind of understandable and also not understandable criticism to even the idea of the pilot. Probably quite unsurprisingly, GB News was really anti it, and some other kind of right-wing commentators like Richard Littlejohn in the Daily Mail, who just described the NHS as having an insatiable appetite for taxpayers' money. So there has been a lot of criticism around this idea. But I also do think it's worth remembering that we're facing a mental health crisis in this country, which has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. Social prescribing was first introduced in 2019, but it's really been front and centre of the NHS's COVID response, and it's been supporting people whose mental health has deteriorated recently due to lockdowns and isolation and factors like long COVID too. So I think we will see more initiatives like this that are kind of thinking outside the box and trying to deal with this huge crisis that we're facing. And I think that that's a positive thing, because in many ways the current approach to mental health is not enough, and it's not necessarily working for everyone.
Do you think, Alok, if we see good results from this trial, that the likes of, I mean, not Richard Littlejohn personally, but his readers, are likely to change their minds, or be willing to change their minds, or be prepared to change their minds based on the evidence, even if their knee-jerk feeling is, this is nonsense?
Well, look, in our polarised world, I'm not sure anything changes anyone's minds. But maybe hard money will. I mean, I don't know if the angry columnists who want to sort of pour scorn upon these sorts of ideas and to say that it's a waste of taxpayer money, back to that again, but a waste of taxpayer money to sort of do comedy courses. I wonder if they realise how much mental health provision in it costs, how much drugs cost, how much it costs to send someone to hospital who hasn't had help beforehand. If you can intervene, that's the whole point of public health. If you can intervene well before with things that are simple, then it allows people to not go to hospital. It stops the waste of money. And it's kind of the fundamental thing I think that people who just scream and shout into the void don't understand, is that if you stop problems well before they become big problems, then you save a lot of money. And I think somebody said earlier, about whether prescribing comedy courses or exercise or any of these sorts of things, which I think all of which are great and worth trying. Someone said that prescribing them might be seen as a sort of dismissal of someone's problems, pull your socks up or something. And I think actually it's not. I think it's the opposite. It's been shown quite effectively in clinical trials and other places that if you just talk to someone about anything, even if it's a physical problem, a doctor or a medical professional or anyone just giving someone 5 minutes of time to help for them to explain something that's wrong with them already makes most people feel better, and they don't need any more treatment after that. It's how loads of things like homeopathy and other things work. It's placebo effect. It's the mind, and you say that it's the chemicals that matter. Perhaps you need the chemicals that in your brain to change. Feeling better changes the chemicals in your brain. That's what happens. And so I think this is all positive. It's all good. It saves money. And yeah, I'm all for it. Perhaps the angry columnists don't want comedy courses because they don't have any jokes to tell. They're not funny people,
Well, I am prescribing a third story from Sorcha after this. Okay, Sorcha, you're finishing the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the beginning of the end for the UK's war on drugs?
Legalisation and regulation never leads to higher numbers. Nowhere in the world where there's been an element of legalisation or regulation of drugs has there ever been an increase in problem drug use. It's never happened before. In every single case where you've had some degree of more rational and pragmatic and medically based policy in relation to drugs, there has been a fall either in the number of users or in the harms that are caused to society, or both.
Barrister and writer Chris Daw QC speaking to politics.co.uk back in April. Sorcha, what's the story?
The London Mayor Sadiq Khan is reported to be developing a pilot scheme that would effectively decriminalise or depenalise Class B drugs for young people caught with some illicit substances in the capital. The scheme is based on a trial conducted by the Thames Valley Police, and it would be rolled out across 3 London boroughs, which are Lewisham, Bexley and Greenwich. And it would offer classes and counselling to under 25s caught with small amounts of cannabis rather than face arrest.
Not comedy courses?
Not comedy courses. Well, maybe. Who knows? I don't think that's currently part of the plan. The London Mayor's office has stressed that the plans are a limited trial and they're still in development and they haven't been approved by City Hall yet.
And there was some criticism from the Home Office, wasn't there? But isn't it? It sounds to me rather similar to some other government-backed initiatives anyway.
Yeah, so the Home Office has criticised the plans and so has the Prime Minister. But in their 10-year drug strategy, they have committed to a £780 million worth of extra funding to rebuild drug treatments and recovery services. So kind of go for a more community-based approach to tackling the use of drugs. But on the flip side, the strategy also pledges to target more people in possession of illegal drugs by applying tougher and more meaningful consequences to those found with them. So there is a bit of a tension there.
So basically the idea, Kate, in London would be if you're found with a small amount of cannabis, so that is clearly for yourself and not excessive, if you're found with that, essentially there's no criminal repercussion to that. This isn't the first time we've seen that sort of proposal, is it, either?
Yeah, no, it's really not. The programme's actually quite similar to another scheme which was started by the Met last year and run by the Ministry of Justice. And that's a programme called Chance to Change, and it's running in Yorkshire, where offenders who are accused of low-level drug use can avoid a criminal record. They don't have to admit guilt, but they have to agree to conditions like rehabilitation or paying reparations. And also other police forces around the country use schemes that are similar to the one that Sadiq Khan is proposing. For example, there's something called the Checkpoint Scheme in Durham, which was set up in 2015. And it's a 4-month-long offender management programme tailored to specific individuals who are 18 years old and over. And it gives them the opportunity to tackle issues like mental health, alcohol and drug misuse. And according to the Times, this programme has been really successful. The force has reported lower rates of reoffending, it's reduced police and court time, and there's also another scheme being proposed in London at the same time, which requires young people who are stopped with cannabis to submit to conditions like attending support services.
And the politics is so interesting, isn't it, Alok? Because I guess Sadiq Khan's kind of the highest profile politician in this country to back a measure like this so openly, but as we've been exploring, the direction of travel is quite clear. And yet Boris Johnson came out immediately and said he has no plans to change English policy like this. Keir Starmer came out and said Labour policy isn't going to change. So there's still a feeling that politicians think they'll only get elected if they're seen to be hard on drugs, and yet the public, I think, in poll after poll, support more decriminalisation.
That's exactly right. National politicians have to win the Daily Mail, unfortunately, to get elected, and the Daily Mail does not want drugs to be legalised because it thinks that its heartland readers think that drugs are all evil and terrible and create lots of violence and should be completely squashed, even though about 5 or 6 decades of experience and evidence shows that it's just not worked all around the world. And, you know, wherever drugs have been decriminalised and taken into society in a more sort of positive way, can I say, then there's been no ill effects. I mean, you know, if you want a more ancient example, think about what Prohibition did. Prohibition created Al Capone. Anyway, never mind all of those things. You're not going to get elected anywhere in the world in a liberal democracy by proposing that drugs should be legalised. However, at the local levels in lots of places around the world, this is exactly what's happening. Toronto is a city that recently is looking at decriminalising small amounts of people carrying small amounts of even heroin and fentanyl and cocaine without being prosecuted. So many states across the United States have decriminalised essentially marijuana. You can buy it anywhere in those places. And this is the country who created the war on drugs and where it's the worst in terms of like the effects of it not working. In all these places, small amounts have been decriminalised, but drug trafficking, bringing in the stuff is still illegal, and so it should be. There's a difference between those things. They're connected, of course, but there's a very big difference. So you're not going to get around these politics.
But we have seen, haven't we, Sorcha, in Canada, to take the Canadian example, not a particular decrease in the illegal market. So, I mean, the argument that if you legalise cannabis recreationally, I'm talking about here, well, and medically, that then people won't go to their friendly neighbourhood drug dealer anymore. That's not the case. There's still a huge black market because it's cheaper and easier to get.
Really, the approach is not necessarily how do we clamp down on the trade. It's how do you make sure that people who are using drugs aren't criminalised to the extent which they currently are in many countries in the world, and can seek appropriate help and treatment without fear of prosecution. And I think, for a lot of people across the world and in the UK, that is the direction of travel, and that is the attitude that people are beginning to have. I think in the UK, we are still a small C conservative country. I don't think people necessarily like the idea of decriminalisation or legalisation, but I think you have to eventually say, well, what would we, in an ideal world, we could moralise, or we could do what actually works, which is take a relaxed approach to decriminalisation and legalisation. And in the UK, at least, half of the UK supports legalising cannabis for adult use, and that rises to 2/3 in the capital. So Sadiq Khan's scheme will certainly have a lot of support in London, and 7 in 10 people think in the UK think that criminalisation isn't deterring people from using drugs anyway. So there is, I think, here and in other countries, a want and a call for a fresh approach.
I mean, Kate, I made a flippant reference to the comedy courses, but there is kind of a similarity in a way, which is with a limited pot of money, like the NHS has in that case, and in this case you're talking about the police. Maybe it is better, especially post-pandemic, to stop pursuing people with government money and instead try and encourage a growth industry for British entrepreneurs, which is what cannabis could be, isn't it?
Yeah, the CBD industry definitely is growing a lot at the moment. I think it's probably one of the fastest growing industries around. But I do think, you cited the example of it not necessarily working totally amazingly in Canada, but there are examples of decriminalisation working really well. For example, in Portugal, which decriminalised even harder drugs and has done so since 2001. There, people just get penalties like fines or community service if they're caught for possession. And stats show that it does work, it is effective. So In the first few years after the reforms, drug deaths dropped dramatically, and since then, even though they've risen slightly, they still remain below 2001 levels when the reforms were passed. Similarly, the proportion of people sentenced for drug offences in Portuguese prisons has fallen really dramatically and is now below the European average. Again, levels of drug use in Portugal have been consistently below the European average over the past 20 years, and that contradicts the idea that decriminalisation actively encourages recreational drug use.
And Alok, you were nodding vigorously when I was talking about the entrepreneurial opportunity. I noticed that you've blurred out your plants on Zoom. Is there something you'd like to tell us? Have you got a side hustle?
I will say this, that if you go to the United States where cannabis has been legalized, the innovation in the forms of delivery of cannabis are quite intriguing, and there's industry there, and there's money being made, and that's all I can say, in interesting ways. And I suppose unless it's illegalized, no serious actors are going to actually create products and sell them properly and everything, are they? So there's no one's going to invest in that stuff. But a more serious point is this: anyone who uses economic arguments to say that we shouldn't legalize these things because it's terrible for our economy or whatever, doesn't understand that if you treat drug addiction and drug death as a public health issue, which basically is, then dealing with it at the early stages intelligently is much, much cheaper than dealing with the consequences once you've got the problem like we do now. Plus also, think about all the enforcement costs. Again, going to the Canadian example, in Ontario, where Toronto is, it costs something like 3.5 billion Canadian dollars to enforce drug laws. Even if you took 10% of that money and used it to help treat addiction, or to diverted that money to public health measures that educated people about drugs, or just stopped spending that money on putting people with small amounts of cannabis into prison, you would do a lot more in the long term to save a lot of money, never mind saving lives and livelihoods as well. I just think that the economic arguments are just so much more compelling if you decriminalise.
Well, before we all descend into paranoid laughter, I'm ending things there. My thanks to Kate, Sorcha and Alok for their high-grade stories. I'm off to get some munchies. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found us today via a Spotify playlist, tap Go to Podcast and then tap Follow now. I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.